It is easy to imagine the grand halls of the Georgian court filled with light, music, and the rustle of silk gowns. It is easy to picture the stately portraits of princes and princesses, each one smiling with restrained elegance, frozen forever in oil paint. But behind those gilded frames, behind the titles and ceremony, were human lives often far removed from the image we have inherited. And among them was one woman whose life almost disappeared into history's shadows. She was born into the heart of the British monarchy, the daughter of a king who ruled a vast empire. Her childhood was wrapped in luxury, but also bound tightly by duty. While her brothers fought battles or sat in parliament, and her sisters sometimes found their way into carefully arranged marriages, her own life unfolded along a different path, one of waiting, serving, and watching as the years passed her by. The story of Princess Sophia is not the story you expect from royal history. There are no coronations in her name, no alliances formed by her hand, no sweeping political reforms she authored. Instead, hers is a story of what happens when your life is defined by expectations you never chose. She spent decades in the role of a devoted daughter, a constant presence at her father's side as he struggled with the devastating effects of mental illness. She was there when the court's grand illusions began to crack, when the grandeur of monarchy was overshadowed by the private suffering within its walls. And yet, while Sophia's life might seem like one of quiet compliance, whispers of a secret personal world followed her for years. Rumors swirled of a hidden romance, of a marriage that may or may not have existed, and of choices made in defiance of the rigid rules that bound her. The truth is still tangled in speculation, but what remains undeniable is the way these rumors exposed the fragile position of royal women. In her time, a single misstep, even one that existed only in the public imagination, could cast a shadow over a reputation forever. As the years went on, Sophia's world grew smaller. The glittering life of the court was a distant echo, replaced by the stillness of rooms she had known since childhood. Family losses took their toll, friends disappeared, and her own health declined. The woman who had once been an unseen constant in the royal household became an almost invisible figure to the world outside. When she died, her passing barely stirred public notice. Yet her life, quietly endured in the margins of history, has much to teach us about the hidden costs of royal duty and the personal sacrifices it demanded. Her story is a reminder that history is not only written by the kings and queens whose names fill the textbooks. It is also shaped by those who stood behind them, often unacknowledged but no less important. Today, we step into that shadowed world to bring Princess Sophia's story into the light. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, and in this video, we will uncover the life of Princess Sophia, the unseen royal daughter whose quiet story still echoes with meaning. King George III and Queen Charlotte had 15 children, a family so large that even in their own time, it could be hard to keep track of each individual. The king's reign was marked by political upheaval, wars abroad, and personal tragedy, but behind the formal portraits and political debates was a household filled with princes and princesses who each had their own personalities, preferences, and fates. In such a large family, some children naturally drew more attention than others, either because of their roles in state affairs, their marriages, or their personal scandals. Princess Sophia, the 12th child and 5th daughter, often slips from public memory in part because she neither married nor played a major political role, and because the size of the family itself overshadowed quieter figures like her. When the public and historians look back at the reign of George III, they tend to focus on the king's struggles with illness, the political crises of the American and Napoleonic Wars, and the more dramatic or visible members of the royal family. Sophia's life, while not devoid of intrigue, unfolded largely in the background of these larger events. Sophia was born in the year 1777, at a time when the American Revolutionary War was in its final stages, and the British crown was facing both military and political challenges. She was the king's 12th child, which placed her near the younger end of the family hierarchy. Her birth came at a point when her parents were already seasoned in the business of raising royal offspring. The early lives of the royal children were shaped by the personality and values of their parents. George III was deeply devoted to his family, priding himself on his role as a moral and attentive father, and Queen Charlotte took an active role in their upbringing. The royal nursery followed a structured and somewhat sheltered routine, designed to keep the children well-mannered, educated, and safe from the perceived corrupting influences of the outside world. This upbringing, while idyllic in certain respects, could also be isolating. The children of George III and Queen Charlotte grew up in a tightly managed environment within palaces and country residences, surrounded by attendants, tutors, and a few carefully selected companions. Their lives were full of comfort and privilege, yet the boundaries around them were firm. They were expected to behave in ways that upheld the dignity of the monarchy, to study diligently, and to avoid unnecessary exposure to society until their parents deemed it appropriate. For Sophia, as for her siblings, this meant that her childhood was defined by a mixture of closeness to her brothers and sisters and distance from the wider world. Being one of so many siblings created both opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, the royal children had constant companionship. They shared lessons, games, and family occasions, developing bonds that would last into adulthood. On the other hand, individuality could be lost in the crowd. The elder siblings, particularly the future George IV, the Duke of York, and the Duke of Clarence, were more visible because of their direct roles in politics, the military, or the line of succession. The older princesses, like Charlotte, Augusta, and Elizabeth, were also better known because they were closer to marriageable age during a time when royal alliances were matters of public interest. Sophia, younger and less directly involved in these public-facing duties in her early years, did not attract the same level of attention. Her position in the family meant that her life was shaped by the example set by her elder siblings, but also by the increasingly complex circumstances surrounding her parents. George III's reign during Sophia's youth was marked by a sense of stability in domestic affairs, but also by undercurrents of tension, both political and personal. By the time she was old enough to be aware of public life, her father's bouts of illness were becoming a matter of concern within the family. These episodes, though kept as private as possible at first, cast a shadow over the otherwise ordered life of the court. For a child in Sophia's position, this could have contributed to a sense of uncertainty or unease, even if the daily routines remained much the same. Sophia's earliest years were spent moving between royal residences such as Buckingham House, Kew, and Windsor. These locations offered grand surroundings and beautiful gardens, and the royal children were encouraged to spend time outdoors in healthy pursuits. Education was rigorous, with instruction in languages, history, music, and the arts. The king himself took pride in his children's studies, and Queen Charlotte ensured that the princesses were taught skills considered suitable for their roles, such as fine needlework and the ability to converse in multiple languages. Music, in particular, played an important role in their upbringing. Queen Charlotte was a patron of the arts, and several of the children, including Sophia, showed talent in this area. However, this sheltered and disciplined environment could also leave the children ill-prepared for the social realities they would eventually face. The court of George III was known for its moral strictness compared to some of the more flamboyant royal households in Europe. While this approach reflected the king's personal values, it also meant that the princesses, including Sophia, were often kept from the wider aristocratic social scene for longer than was typical. Marriage negotiations were handled with extreme caution, and as a result, several of the king's daughters remained unmarried well into adulthood or for their entire lives. This later became a defining aspect of Sophia's personal story, but in her early years, the emphasis was simply on education, propriety, and familial loyalty. Within the family circle, Sophia was known for her affectionate nature. Accounts from those who knew her suggest she was gentle, kind, and somewhat shy. While she enjoyed the company of her siblings, she was not one of the more forceful personalities in the family. This may have been another reason her public profile was relatively modest in comparison to others. In such a large royal household, those with stronger or more controversial characters tended to dominate attention, both in private family life and in the eyes of the public. The sheer scale of George III's family meant that the birth of each new child, while celebrated, was less of a singular national event than it might have been in a smaller royal household. Sophia's arrival was one more addition to a line of healthy royal children, and while this was a source of personal joy for the king and queen, it did not carry the same political weight as the birth of an heir. By the time Sophia was born, there was already a secure succession in place through her elder brothers, which further reduced any immediate public interest in her as an individual. Over time, this relative lack of attention in her formative years contributed to the way her life story has been overshadowed by those of her siblings. Despite the distance between the royal household and the outside world, the children were not entirely cut off from current events. They were aware, at least in general terms, of the political challenges their father faced, and they sometimes met notable figures of the time. But their role in such encounters was largely ceremonial, and for Sophia as a younger child, these moments would have been more about formality than genuine engagement with political matters. Her world was still primarily that of the family, the tutors, and the gardens and rooms of the royal residences. Sophia's place in history is easy to overlook because her life in these early years did not involve dramatic incidents or public roles. Yet this very quietness can tell us a great deal about what it meant to be a younger child in a large royal family in the 18th century. Her story reflects the balance between privilege and restriction, between the affection of a close-knit family and the limitations imposed by status and duty. It also illustrates how, in the shadow of more prominent figures, the lives of certain royals can fade from collective memory, even though they shared in the experiences and challenges of their time. Sophia's life as she grew older remained bound by the same framework that had shaped her childhood, but the boundaries became both more visible and more confining. In a family where loyalty, discretion, and obedience were held as core virtues, she understood from an early age that her personal desires would often be secondary to the needs of the crown and the reputation of the monarchy. This sense of expectation did not come in the form of explicit orders for every step she took, but rather through the atmosphere in which she lived. The rules, both spoken and unspoken, were absorbed through years of training in manners, morals, and self-control. For Sophia, the result was a life in which she knew what was required of her, even if she was never directly told that certain choices were impossible. The central challenge for the daughters of George III was that the balance between public duty and private happiness was often tilted heavily toward the former. A royal princess could not simply marry a man she liked or choose a life away from court without intense scrutiny and potential scandal. The king, deeply protective of his daughters, delayed marriage negotiations for many of them far longer than was customary. His caution came partly from genuine affection and a desire to shield them from unsuitable matches, but it also reflected his belief in maintaining the dignity and stability of the royal house. For Sophia, this meant that by the time she reached the age when most young women of her rank would be considering marriage, she was still living within the controlled world of the royal residences, with no clear prospect of change. The expectations placed upon her were not just about marriage or public appearances. They extended into every aspect of her conduct. A princess was to be gracious, discreet, modest, and above all loyal to her family. In many ways, Sophia fulfilled these expectations with quiet diligence. She was not known for rebellion or for seeking the spotlight, and this made her dependable in the eyes of her parents. Yet this same compliance may have deepened the sense of invisibility that already surrounded her. Her more assertive siblings, by virtue of their actions or controversies, drew notice in ways Sophia did not. As she moved from adolescence into adulthood, the world outside the palace walls was undergoing major change. Britain was engaged in wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France, political reforms were being debated, and industrial and social shifts were reshaping society. Inside the court, however, life for the princesses continued in the same pattern of formal events, music and art, and carefully managed interactions. Sophia would have been aware of the tensions in the wider world, but her own role remained largely passive. She might attend concerts, receive distinguished visitors, and participate in ceremonial occasions, but she did so as part of a collective royal presence rather than as an individual figure with her own platform. The duty to maintain appearances was complicated by the increasing ill health of the king. His bouts of mental illness became more severe and more public over time, placing emotional strain on the entire family. Sophia, devoted to her father, felt these episodes keenly. The stability of her early life had depended on the strong presence of her parents, and as the king's condition worsened, the atmosphere within the royal household shifted. Queen Charlotte took on more responsibility in managing both the family and the public face of the monarchy, and the princesses were drawn into this effort as well. Sophia's role, though still in the background, involved offering support to her mother, maintaining the routine of royal life, and helping to present an image of unity to the public. This was not an easy position. The formality of royal life allowed little space for open discussion of private grief or frustration. Yet those emotions inevitably existed. The duty to appear serene and composed often meant suppressing personal feelings, a habit Sophia likely developed early and carried into adulthood. To those outside the family, she may have seemed content in her quiet role, but such appearances can hide a more complicated inner life. It was during these years that whispers and rumors began to surround Sophia, as they often did with royal figures who lived without marriage or clear public roles. Some accounts suggest she may have formed attachments that were not officially recognized, and these stories, true or not, reflect the tension between the expectations placed on her and the normal human desire for companionship. In an environment where a princess's every friendship could be scrutinized for hints of impropriety, maintaining a private life was nearly impossible. If Sophia experienced affection or romance, it would have been overshadowed by the need for secrecy and discretion, a burden that could easily give rise to hidden sorrow. The image of Sophia that emerges from historical accounts is of a woman who was gentle and good-natured, yet touched by melancholy. The limitations of her role were not unique to her. Many of her sisters faced the same frustrations, but each experienced them differently. For Sophia, who lacked the stronger political or social ambitions of some of her siblings, the sense of being overlooked may have been sharper. She was present for family celebrations and royal duties, yet rarely the center of attention. Her life became defined by a pattern of repetition, with few opportunities to step outside the boundaries set for her. Her situation was made more difficult by the growing public interest in the private lives of the royal family. Newspapers and pamphlets of the time were quick to publish gossip, often without regard for accuracy, and the large number of royal children provided ample material for speculation. Sophia's reserved nature meant she did not court such attention, but she could not entirely escape it. Any deviation from expected behavior, however small, could be magnified into a rumor. In such a climate, maintaining a reputation for propriety required constant vigilance. The sorrow in Sophia's life was not only about personal loneliness or unfulfilled dreams. It was also tied to the gradual loss of the family life she had known. The illnesses of the king, the pressures on Queen Charlotte, and the eventual dispersal of her siblings into marriages or other roles changed the character of the royal household. What had once been a busy, closely knit group began to fragment, and Sophia, who had spent so much of her life within that circle, found herself more isolated. While she remained close to some of her sisters, the shared daily life of the family was gone, replaced by occasional visits and formal gatherings. Through it all, Sophia continued to fulfill her role with dignity. She participated in charitable work, supported her mother, and maintained the decorum expected of her. Yet beneath the surface, there was likely a sense of what might have been, a recognition that the life she had lived was shaped less by personal choice than by the unyielding structures of royalty. This was the hidden sorrow of her existence. To serve faithfully within a system that left little room for individuality, while watching others, both inside and outside the family, lead lives of greater freedom. As the years went on, the shape of her life changed less and less. With no marriage prospects and no official role beyond her position as a princess, she settled into a quiet routine. The grand events of history continued to unfold. Wars ended, political reforms advanced, new reigns began, but Sophia's place remained much the same. In the public eye, she was a figure of respectability, yet in the historical record, she became increasingly obscure. Her story is a reminder that not all members of a royal family live in the spotlight, and that some carry the weight of expectation in ways that leave little trace on the pages of history. The overarching theme of Sophia's life is one of duty maintained at personal cost. She was born into a position that brought immense privilege but also strict limitations, and she navigated that world with patience and loyalty. Yet behind the formal portraits and ceremonial appearances was a woman whose choices were few and whose inner life was largely hidden from view. Her legacy lies not in grand achievements or public influence, but in the quiet endurance with which she met the demands placed upon her, and in the poignant truth that a life lived in service to expectation can carry a sorrow that is seldom seen but deeply felt. The later years of George III's reign cast a long shadow over his family, and that shadow fell heaviest on those who remained closest to him. For the younger daughters, including Sophia, the reality of their father's illness was not only a personal sorrow, but also a force that shaped the very structure of their lives. The king who had once been the steady anchor of their childhood became a figure of uncertainty, his health wavering between periods of rationality and deep, troubling episodes. What had been the stable world of their youth was gradually replaced by a court defined by caution, privacy, and a constant effort to preserve dignity in the face of decline. The signs of his mental distress had been present for years, but as Sophia moved into adulthood, the illness grew more frequent and severe. These episodes could be unpredictable. At times, the king was able to converse with warmth and clarity, speaking with his daughters as he always had, encouraging their studies or praising their accomplishments. At other times, he was agitated, confused, and unreachable. For the unmarried princesses, who still lived under the same roof or nearby, these swings created a sense of instability that was difficult to escape. They were expected to show calm and patience, to be comforting presences when he was unwell, and to carry on their duties as though nothing were amiss. The emotional strain of this situation was magnified by the secrecy that surrounded it. Royal illness, especially of the mind, was a matter to be hidden as much as possible from the public. Servants, attendants, and even members of the extended family were bound by discretion, and the princesses learned early on to guard their words. For Sophia, this meant that she could not speak openly about what she was witnessing, even to close friends. Whatever fears or frustrations she felt had to be contained within a narrow circle, reinforcing the isolation that already marked her life. The king's condition also affected the decisions made about his daughters' futures. With their father unable to engage in consistent governance, or even family decision-making, the queen became the central figure in arranging, or delaying, their marriages. Queen Charlotte, already inclined toward caution, grew even more protective and controlling. The presence of her unmarried daughters in the household offered her comfort and support during this difficult time, but it also meant that their prospects for independence diminished. Marriage negotiations, already slow, often stalled entirely. In a different set of circumstances, Sophia might have been sent abroad to marry into a foreign royal house, or paired with a nobleman who could meet the requirements of rank and alliance. But with the king's health uncertain and the queen reluctant to part with her daughters, such opportunities faded. Life in the royal residences changed to accommodate the realities of the king's illness. Routines were adjusted to avoid disturbing him, and certain areas of the palace became off-limits during his worst periods. The once lively atmosphere of family life became quieter, more subdued. For Sophia, who had always been accustomed to a structured existence, the difference was subtle but profound. The rules of her world were no longer just about etiquette and duty, but about managing the unpredictable rhythms of an ailing monarch. Each day carried the possibility of disruption, and the emotional climate of the household could shift without warning. This constant awareness of her father's fragility must have left a lasting mark. There was the sorrow of watching a beloved parent lose his grasp on reality, but also the practical consequences of his condition for her own life. Without a clear role to play in public affairs, without marriage or children to occupy her, Sophia's identity was bound tightly to the family and to her role as a dutiful daughter. Her own needs and ambitions, if she had them, were secondary to the unspoken imperative of being present, loyal, and steady in a time of uncertainty. The psychological toll of this environment is difficult to measure, but contemporary accounts suggest that the younger princesses grew more withdrawn as the years went on. They shared a deep affection for one another, finding in their sisterly bonds some measure of comfort, but they also lived with the knowledge that their lives were not unfolding as they might have hoped. For Sophia, whose temperament was already gentle and reserved, the combination of seclusion, restricted choices, and constant exposure to her father's suffering could only have deepened her quiet melancholy. The public, of course, saw only glimpses of this reality. Official bulletins might note the king's indisposition in vague terms, but the true nature of his illness was rarely acknowledged openly. When Sophia appeared at court functions or charitable events, she would have been expected to carry herself with grace and composure, giving no sign of the strain she endured in private. This dual existence, outwardly serene, inwardly burdened, was a hallmark of royal life, but in her case it was made more intense by the closeness of her daily contact with the king. As his illness worsened, the formal structure of the monarchy had to adapt. The Regency Act was put into effect, and the Prince of Wales assumed many of the duties of kingship. For the princesses, this shift altered the balance of power within the family. The Queen remained a central figure in their lives, but the influence of their elder brother grew. Sophia's relationship with the Prince of Wales was cordial but not particularly close, and his priorities did not include finding marriages for his younger sisters. In this new arrangement, there was even less impetus to change her situation. The years of her father's decline passed in a kind of suspended state. There were moments of brightness, visits from friends, time spent with her sisters, musical performances, but the backdrop was always the same. The king's condition rarely improved for long, and the sense of living in a household defined by illness became permanent. For a woman in Sophia's position, the future was not something to be shaped, but something to be endured. In later life, when the king's blindness and incapacity were complete, Sophia's role shifted again. She was part of the inner circle that maintained the appearance of normalcy, visiting him and offering what comfort she could. By then, her own path was set. There would be no marriage, no children, and no public role beyond her identity as the daughter of the king. The sorrow of this outcome was compounded by the knowledge that much of it had been determined by circumstances beyond her control. The shadow of George III's illness did not just affect the political life of the nation. It reached into the private corners of his daughters' lives, shaping their choices and limiting their freedoms. For Sophia, it meant that her adult years were spent in a state of quiet loyalty, her personal story inseparable from the decline of her father. The duty she had been raised to value above all else became both her guiding principle and her greatest limitation. In the end, her life was defined not by the titles she held or the events she shaped, but by the constancy with which she stood in that shadow, fulfilling her role while carrying the weight of a sorrow that was as enduring as it was unseen. By the time George III's illness had become a permanent reality rather than an intermittent crisis, the lives of his younger, unmarried daughters had settled into a pattern that few outside the royal household fully understood. These women, often referred to in later accounts as the spinster princesses, were bound to the court not only by duty, but also by the decisions and anxieties of their parents. In theory, the daughters of a reigning monarch were valuable assets in the network of European royal alliances. In practice, under George III and Queen Charlotte, they became a closely guarded circle, kept near their parents and rarely permitted to marry. This was partly the result of political caution, and partly the result of personal preference. The king, affectionate and deeply protective of his daughters, was reluctant to see them leave England for foreign courts. The Queen, who relied on their companionship and support, encouraged their continued presence in the household. For Sophia, this meant that marriage was never treated as an urgent matter, even during the years when she might have made a politically advantageous match. By the time she was in her 20s, she had already passed the age at which most royal women of her generation were wed. Unlike her brothers, whose futures were mapped out in terms of military careers or political roles, her path was defined by proximity to the family and the quiet fulfillment of duties within the court. The label of spinster princess, though not one they would have used themselves, reflected the way the public eventually saw them: respectable, dutiful, and somewhat pitiable figures whose lives revolved around their parents rather than their own households. Sophia's particular position within this group was shaped by her closeness to her father. While all the unmarried daughters played a role in supporting Queen Charlotte, it was Sophia who became one of George III's most consistent companions during his long decline. Her nature, gentle, patient, and unassuming, suited her to the task. She could spend hours in his company, whether he was lucid or lost in confusion, without showing irritation or fatigue. She learned how to speak to him in ways that calmed his agitation, how to listen when his words wandered, and how to keep her own emotions in check when confronted with his distress. This caregiving role was not formally assigned, but it became hers through a combination of circumstance and temperament. She was not the eldest of the unmarried daughters, but her patience and steadiness meant that she was often the one most welcome at her father's side. For Sophia, this was both a source of quiet pride and a heavy burden. The affection she felt for her father was genuine and deep, yet the years spent tending to his needs also narrowed her world. Every hour devoted to his care was an hour that could not be spent cultivating her own life or interests. The routines of this caregiving life were shaped by the unpredictable nature of George III's illness. On days when he was well, Sophia's role was more like that of a companion, reading to him, playing music, or walking with him in the gardens. On days when his mind was troubled, she acted as a calming presence, sitting quietly by his side, steering conversations gently, or simply being there to reassure him. She witnessed not only the moments of clarity, but also the long stretches of confusion, the sudden bursts of temper, and the heartbreaking lapses in memory. Her life in this period was marked by a strange duality. In public, she appeared at court functions as a serene, well-mannered princess, dressed elegantly and moving through the formalities of royal life with practiced ease. In private, she was part nurse, part daughter, and part silent witness to the gradual fading of the man who had once been the steady center of the family. Few outside the household would have recognized the emotional weight of this role, or the way it shaped her sense of self over time. As the years went by and George III's condition became irreversible, Sophia's identity became even more entwined with her role as caregiver. The possibility of marriage, already remote, vanished entirely. No suitor could reasonably be expected to court a princess so bound to her father's side. And the queen, whose own health and spirits were declining, was unwilling to part with the daughters who supported her through the long ordeal. Sophia was not alone in this. Her sisters Augusta and Mary also remained unmarried for much of their lives, though Mary would eventually wed in middle age. Together they formed a small, tight-knit group, their days revolving around their parents' needs and the rhythms of the court. The spinster princesses were often portrayed in later history as passive victims of circumstance, but this view oversimplifies their reality. While it is true that they had little choice in the larger shape of their lives, they were active in fulfilling the duties expected of them. Sophia, in particular, displayed a quiet strength that allowed her to carry the burden of her father's care for decades without public complaint. She was trusted with the intimate, often difficult work of maintaining his comfort and dignity, and she carried out this role in a way that earned the respect of those who saw her in that capacity. Still, the cost of such a life was undeniable. Sophia's world narrowed to the confines of the royal residences, Windsor, Kew and others, where her days followed a cycle dictated by the needs of her father and the formalities of court life. Opportunities for travel were rare, and even social engagements were limited by her obligations. She was surrounded by luxury and privilege, yet her personal freedom was as constrained as that of any cloistered figure in history. In this environment, the emotional bonds between the sisters were vital. They shared not only their duties, but also their private frustrations and small pleasures. They read together, embroidered, played music, and took walks in the gardens. These moments of companionship offered a sense of normalcy within the unchanging framework of their lives. Yet even these relationships were shaped by their shared role as caregivers. When one sister was called to attend to their father, the others stepped in to cover household duties or offer comfort to their mother. Sophia's role continued into her middle and later years, long after the hope of a different life had faded. By then, the caregiving had become second nature. She knew how to navigate her father's unpredictable moods, how to draw on shared memories to soothe him, and how to avoid subjects that might cause distress. She had learned the art of presence, of being there without intruding, of offering comfort without making demands. These skills, developed over years of patient practice, were invisible to the public, but essential to the stability of the royal household. As George III's physical health declined alongside his mental state, Sophia's responsibilities shifted again. She became a steady presence in his final years, ensuring that he was never without company, that his surroundings were orderly, and that the courtesies due to him as a king were maintained even in the privacy of his rooms. She bore witness to the slow fading of his life, just as she had borne witness to the long decline of his mind. When he died, Sophia was in her 40s, and the role that had defined her for so long came to an abrupt end. The loss was profound, not only of a father she had loved and served, but also of the daily purpose that had structured her existence for decades. In the years that followed, she remained within the royal family's orbit, But her life had been shaped so completely by her long service to her father that it was impossible to reinvent herself entirely. She continued to appear at court, to support her siblings, and to live in the same measured, private manner that had characterized her adult life. The story of Sophia's decades as a caregiver is not one of grand gestures or dramatic events. It is instead a story of constancy, patience, and endurance. Her devotion to her father, while born of love, was also the product of a system that valued the service of royal daughters over their independence. The same forces that kept her unmarried also kept her at her father's side, making her one of the most consistent figures in his final years. She was, in a sense, both a victim of circumstance and a quiet architect of stability within a household marked by illness and change. Sophia's life cannot be understood without acknowledging the years she spent in that role. The label of spinster princess may reduce her to a stereotype, but the reality was far more complex. She was a daughter who gave much of her life to the care of a father whose mind was lost to him, a woman who carried the weight of duty with grace, and a figure whose story reveals the human side of monarchy in an age when public image often obscured private truth. The decades she devoted to her father's care were not only a testament to her loyalty, but also a reminder of the quiet sacrifices that can define a life as fully as any crown or title. The image that history has preserved of Sophia is one of a dutiful daughter, constant companion, and patient caregiver, but woven through her quiet life was a thread of rumor that refused to fade. For all the discipline and restraint expected of her, there were whispers that she had strayed beyond the rigid boundaries set for a royal woman of her time. These whispers were not merely idle gossip. They became part of the public conversation about her, shaping perceptions in ways that she could neither control nor completely silence. The most enduring of these stories involved General Thomas Garth, a soldier of distinguished service and, more importantly in this context, a man whose name was linked to hers in a manner that suggested something far more personal than a formal acquaintance. The rumors centered on the claim that Sophia and General Garth had engaged in a relationship that went beyond propriety and, in the most sensational versions, that they had secretly married or that she had borne him a child. Such tales were deeply damaging in an age when the private conduct of royal women was expected to be beyond reproach. Whether the relationship existed in the form the gossips claimed is difficult to say with certainty. What is clear is that the story took hold and was repeated in various forms over the years, becoming a fixed point in the web of speculation that surrounded her. In a family so conscious of public image, such rumors were more than personal embarrassments. They were perceived as potential threats to the dignity of the crown. For a woman in Sophia's position, there was almost no way to counter them effectively. Direct denials might have brought more attention to the matter, while silence allowed others to imagine the worst. The royal household's instinct was to ignore scandal wherever possible, hoping it would fade. Yet in a period when the appetite for royal gossip was growing, fueled by an expanding press and a more politically engaged public, such stories rarely disappeared entirely. The figure of General Garth himself only added fuel to the speculation. He was a man of solid reputation in the military, respected for his service, and not without charm. His association with Sophia was close enough to be noticed, but not so constant as to make their relationship obvious in day-to-day court life. This ambiguity created space for the more suggestive narratives that newspapers and pamphlets could exploit. Some accounts went so far as to claim that the child born to Sophia in secrecy had been placed in the care of others, hidden from public view but known to those within the royal circle. To modern eyes, such tales might be seen as the predictable exaggerations of a gossip-driven press, but in the society of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the stakes were much higher. For a princess, even the hint of a sexual relationship outside of marriage could ruin prospects, undermine her standing, and cast a shadow over her entire family. It is worth remembering that royal women were seen not as private individuals, but as symbols of national morality and dynastic continuity. Any suggestion that they had acted outside of the accepted norms threatened not only their personal reputations, but also the carefully maintained image of the monarchy as an institution. Sophia's supposed involvement with General Garth must also be understood in the context of her constrained life. Years of seclusion, combined with the slow extinguishing of any realistic marriage prospects, created a climate in which personal attachments, if they existed, were almost inevitably clandestine. The very structure of her world made openness impossible. If she did form an emotional connection, she would have known from the beginning that it could not be acknowledged. Such a relationship, therefore, would have been lived in shadow, its reality obscured by necessity, its existence denied even in moments when it might have offered comfort. The pressures of royal life meant that Sophia's choices were sharply limited. She could maintain the spotless image expected of her and continue in the role assigned to her, or she could risk personal happiness against the near certainty of scandal. The rumor of a secret marriage to Garth suggests the latter, though it is just as possible that the story grew out of less dramatic interactions magnified by a watchful and sometimes hostile press. In either case, the fact that such a story could gain traction illustrates the precarious position of women in her station. Public scrutiny of royal women was unrelenting, and it operated on the assumption that their lives were public property. Even the smallest deviation from routine, the most minor departure from established patterns, could be seized upon as evidence of impropriety. This scrutiny was particularly harsh when it came to matters of personal relationships. For a royal man, an affair might provoke commentary, but rarely lasting damage. For a royal woman, it could define her entirely. Sophia lived under this double standard, her every step measured against ideals of virtue that allowed no margin for human error. It is also significant that the period in which these rumors circulated was one of increasing freedom for the press. Newspapers were becoming more daring in their coverage of the royal family, and pamphleteers felt emboldened to speculate on matters that would once have been considered too delicate for public discussion. This was part of a broader shift in the relationship between the monarchy and the public. While earlier generations had maintained a more formal distance, the growing literate population and the appetite for sensational stories eroded those barriers. Sophia, by virtue of her position and her unmarried state, became an ideal subject for such attention. In this climate, truth was often secondary to the appeal of a compelling narrative. The image of a sheltered princess caught in a forbidden romance was irresistible to the gossip mongers. It allowed readers to imagine the human passions behind the ceremonial facades of royalty, even as it confirmed the public's fascination with moral lapses among the highborn. For Sophia, the persistence of these stories would have been a source of private pain, not least because she could do so little to dispel them without inviting further intrusion. Her experience reflects the broader reality faced by royal women in her era. Their lives were shaped as much by what they were rumored to have done as by what they actually did. The court could be a place of grandeur and privilege, but it was also a small world where personal privacy was nearly impossible to maintain. Servants, attendants, and even family members could be sources of information for those willing to pay for it. In such an environment, rumors could start with a kernel of truth, a meeting, a letter, a shared carriage ride, or with nothing at all, and still spread beyond control. For Sophia, whose adult life had already been constrained by her role as caregiver and companion to her father, this additional layer of scrutiny must have felt both invasive and deeply unjust. Her years of service, her quiet endurance, and her loyalty counted for little against the allure of scandal. The public might admire her devotion to the king, but the suggestion of a secret romance with Garth was the story that endured, preserved in memoirs, letters, and retrospective accounts that valued intrigue over accuracy. The consequences of such scrutiny went beyond reputation. They reinforced the barriers that kept Sophia and her sisters tied to the court, as any move toward independence could be framed as suspect. For a woman already seen through the lens of rumor, even the most innocent actions could be reinterpreted in ways that confirmed the gossip. This created a cycle from which there was no easy escape. The more closely she was watched, the more likely she was to be the subject of further speculation. In the end, whether the relationship with General Garth existed in the form imagined by the public may matter less than the fact that it was believed. Belief was enough to alter the way she was perceived, to color the way her life was recorded, and to ensure that her name would be linked with his in the historical record. It was a reminder that for royal women of her time, personal happiness was always contingent, always subject to the veto of public opinion and the unyielding expectations of propriety. Sophia's story, when viewed in this light, is not just about the truth or falsehood of a particular rumor. It is about the fragile space in which royal women were allowed to exist, the narrow boundaries within which they were expected to live, and the ease with which those boundaries could be breached by speculation. It is also about resilience, for despite the persistence of these stories, she continued to fulfill her duties, to maintain her place within the family, and to live out the role she had been given. She did so without public complaint, even as the shadow of gossip trailed her for the rest of her life. The rumors about Sophia and General Garth become more than a footnote in her biography. They reveal the intersection of personal vulnerability and public fascination, the way in which a life of quiet service could still be marked by controversy in a world where royal women had no refuge from scrutiny. They also remind us that the truth of such matters is often less important to history than the story that survives, and that in Sophia's case, that story has become inseparable from the way she is remembered. The story of the rumors surrounding Sophia's life cannot be separated from the deeper truth that underpinned them: the isolation and lack of agency that royal princesses endured in her era. These women were born into a world of extraordinary privilege, but found themselves denied the very freedoms that might have made such privilege meaningful. They were raised to embody grace, duty, and decorum, but those same qualities were used to justify keeping them under constant supervision, and within narrow boundaries. For Sophia, as for her sisters, the royal household was both home and confinement. From childhood, their lives were arranged according to the wishes of their parents, and those arrangements seldom loosened with age. While a royal son might be granted military commands, political influence, or the liberty to pursue his own interests, a royal daughter's path was almost entirely determined for her. Her education was designed to make her accomplished and charming, yet never independent in thought or ambition. Even the choice of companions, whether friends, ladies-in-waiting, or potential suitors, was controlled by others. In such an environment, it was difficult for any genuine, unsupervised relationship to develop. Sophia's own life illustrates how this lack of agency shaped not only personal happiness, but also identity. She spent much of her adulthood in the role of dutiful daughter and caregiver, her schedule dictated by her father's condition and the routines of the court. These responsibilities left little opportunity for self-determination. Her daily movements were limited to the residences approved for her, her engagements planned in accordance with the family's needs, and her social life bound to official occasions. Over time, the repetition of these patterns could blur the distinction between personal choice and obligation, until choice itself became an unfamiliar. The isolation of the princesses was not merely physical but emotional. Within the royal family, they might be surrounded by siblings, attendants, and visitors, yet they were often alone in the most meaningful sense. Conversation, companionship, and trust were all constrained by the knowledge that any careless word or action could be misinterpreted or reported. In such a climate, it was safer to keep one's thoughts private, even at the cost of deeper connection. For Sophia, who was by nature reserved, this tendency toward guardedness may have been both a survival strategy and a habit that deepened over time. The restrictions placed on them were reinforced by a constant awareness of public scrutiny. Royal women were viewed as embodiments of national virtue, their conduct seen as a reflection on the monarchy itself. This meant that even innocent friendships could be examined for impropriety, and any hint of emotional attachment outside approved boundaries could provoke scandal. In Sophia's case, the rumors about General Garth showed how quickly such speculation could take root, and how powerless she was to shape the narrative. If the relationship was false, she had no effective way to disprove it. If it was true, she had no safe way to acknowledge it. Either way, her voice was absent from the story told about her. This absence of control over her own image was a symptom of the broader lack of agency in her life. Decisions about where she lived, whom she saw, and how she spent her time were made by others. Even in middle age, she was expected to seek approval for the smallest changes to her routine. The idea of forging an independent life was not simply discouraged, it was almost unthinkable. The role of a royal princess was to serve the family, preserve its dignity, and avoid actions that might compromise its image. Personal fulfillment was secondary, if it was considered at all. The result of these constraints was a kind of genteel loneliness. Sophia's world was comfortable and secure, yet it was also closed and repetitive. There was beauty in her surroundings and ceremony in her daily life, but little variety or freedom. She might attend concerts, dinners, and public celebrations, but these were formal occasions governed by protocol, not moments of genuine spontaneity or intimacy. Companionship, when it existed, often came from within the same small circle she had known for decades, leaving little room for the new relationships that might have offered fresh perspective or joy. It is telling that many of her sisters shared this fate, their lives following similar patterns of duty, restriction, and emotional seclusion. While some eventually married, these unions often occurred late in life and were shaped more by convenience or political necessity than by personal choice. For those who, like Sophia, remained unmarried, the sense of being permanently set apart from the normal experiences of adulthood, marriage, children, the management of one's own household, must have been acute. This enforced separation from ordinary life also had the effect of heightening the impact of rumor. In a more open or varied life, a single piece of gossip might be absorbed into a larger pattern of public activity and eventually forgotten. But for Sophia, whose existence was already defined by stillness and routine, any unusual detail stood out sharply. The fewer events there were to discuss, the more weight was given to speculation, and the less opportunity she had to counter it with other, more truthful accounts of her life. Over the years, the combination of isolation, lack of agency, and public scrutiny became self-perpetuating. The longer Sophia remained in her role, the more natural it seemed to others that she should stay there. The longer she lived without personal freedom, the less expectation there was that she might claim it. By the time her father died and the strictest obligations of her caregiving role ended, she had spent decades in a structure that left little room for change. Whatever possibilities might have existed for a different kind of life had long since faded. Sophia's experience, while shaped by her specific position and personality, was emblematic of the broader condition of royal daughters in her time. Their lives were carefully managed for the sake of family honor and political stability, but this management often came at the expense of their individuality. They could influence the court's atmosphere through charm, culture, or conversation, but they could rarely influence their own destinies. They were expected to embody an ideal of virtue that was at once admired and confining, an ideal that demanded sacrifice without promising reward. In reflecting on Sophia's life, it becomes clear that the isolation she endured was not simply the result of circumstance, but the product of a system that valued control over personal freedom. Her lack of agency was not a matter of chance. It was a deliberate design, rooted in the belief that royal women were safest and most useful when kept within reach, available to serve the needs of the family, and shielded from the unpredictability of the outside world. That this design also deprived them of companionship, independence, and self-expression was seen as unfortunate but necessary, a private cost for the sake of public image. For Sophia, the consequences of this life were profound. She carried out her duties with grace, maintained her composure under scrutiny, and preserved her loyalty to the family through decades of confinement and speculation. Yet behind that composure was a woman whose choices had been so limited that much of her existence was shaped by the will of others. Her story is not one of rebellion or escape, but of endurance within the narrowest of boundaries, a reminder that the gilded world of royalty could be as confining as it was grand. The final decades of Sophia's life unfolded under the quiet weight of loss, decline, and unspoken sorrow. The constraints that had defined her youth and adulthood remained in place, but time had altered the cast of people around her. Where once there had been a large, bustling royal household filled with siblings, parents, and familiar faces, there were now empty places at the table, rooms that no longer echoed with the voices of brothers and sisters, and a growing sense that her own world was shrinking in both scope and vitality. Death, inevitable for any family, was made even more devastating in her case by the nature of her existence. With so few outlets for companionship and emotional support, the loss of each sibling was not just a personal grief, but also the erosion of one of the few deep connections she possessed. As the years passed, the siblings with whom she had shared the cloistered experience of royal upbringing began to die. These were not merely relatives in a formal sense, but companions in the long stretches of restricted life that had shaped them all. In childhood, they had shared tutors, lessons, and leisure activities. In adulthood, they had shared the burden of living within a system that offered privilege without autonomy. Each death, therefore, took from Sophia not only a family member, but someone who had understood, intimately and without explanation, the nature of her world. When such a connection vanished, it could not be replaced. New acquaintances, no matter how kind or agreeable, could never fill the unique space occupied by a brother or sister who had walked the same narrow path from birth. The cumulative effect of these losses was profound. Sophia, already reserved by temperament, found herself growing more introspective, her social interactions increasingly limited to formal occasions and long-established relationships. The royal household, though still grand in scale, became a quieter and more subdued place for her. The formal rhythm of court life continued, but in private moments there was a stark absence where once there had been the comfort of familiar conversation and shared memories. The large family gatherings of earlier years became rarer, not simply because of the natural passing of time, but because there were fewer people left to attend them. This loneliness was not merely emotional. It carried with it a physical aspect as well. The lack of stimulating change, the repetition of daily routines, and the limited physical activity of a life bound to indoor spaces all began to take a toll on her health. Sophia had never been robust in constitution, and as she aged, the combination of limited exercise, the stress of her responsibilities, and the grief of repeated bereavement began to manifest in various ailments. In a time when medical understanding was still primitive by modern standards, these conditions were treated more with comfort than with effective cure. Periods of fatigue became longer, recovery from illness slower. What might once have been dismissed as minor discomforts now lingered, chipping away at her strength. The environment in which she lived, though luxurious by the standards of most people, was not conducive to vitality. The air in the grand residences could be damp and cold in winter, stuffy in summer, and there was often little opportunity for fresh outdoor activity. Meals, though abundant, were heavy and rich, not the sort of diet likely to promote long-term health. Combined with the mental strain of her circumstances, these factors left her increasingly frail. There is a certain irony in the fact that the very conditions designed to protect and preserve a royal princess could, over the years, undermine her physical well-being. In public, however, Sophia continued to present the image expected of her. She attended events when required, dressed with the understated elegance befitting her rank, and maintained the formal poise that was the hallmark of her upbringing. To the casual observer, she appeared much as she always had, dignified, gracious, and entirely composed. But this image, carefully maintained, concealed the reality of her private life. Behind the scenes, she was coping not only with declining health, but with a deepening sense of solitude. Her circle of confidants reduced, her role in the family more ceremonial than essential. The contrast between her public appearance and private reality was perhaps the most poignant aspect of her later years. Those who saw her at court functions might imagine her as a woman of serene contentment, surrounded by the symbols of rank and the courtesies of high society. Yet in truth, she lived with the knowledge that many of her closest companions were gone, that the opportunities she might once have hoped for had never materialized, and that her own strength was gradually ebbing away. This dissonance between image and reality was not unique to Sophia. Many royal figures have lived similar dual lives, but in her case it was especially stark, because the distance between her inner and outer worlds had been so constant for so long. It is worth noting that the grief of losing siblings was compounded by the memories of what they had endured together. For Sophia, each death was not only the loss of a loved one, but also a reminder of the shared trials of their upbringing. The confinement, the duty, the constant vigilance against scandal, and the limited avenues for personal freedom. These memories, bound up with the individuals themselves, could not be easily set aside. In mourning them, she was also mourning parts of her own past, fragments of her life that had defined her identity for decades. The loneliness that resulted from these losses was not alleviated by the broader social scene. As an unmarried royal woman of advancing age, Sophia was often treated with a certain polite distance. She was respected, even admired, but she did not occupy the kind of role that naturally drew new companions into her life. Younger members of the family were focused on their own circles and concerns, while courtiers and acquaintances observed the necessary formalities, without crossing the invisible lines that separated public familiarity from private intimacy. In this way, She was both constantly surrounded by people and yet profoundly alone. As her health declined, the isolation deepened. Illness often meant withdrawing from public duties, and each absence, while necessary for her recovery, also reduced her visibility in the life of the court. In the eyes of those who saw her less often, she became a more distant figure, remembered rather than regularly encountered. This gradual retreat from the social and ceremonial life she had once known must have been bittersweet. On the one hand, it spared her the demands of constant public performance. On the other, it reinforced the sense of being left behind by a world that moved on without her. Her later years were marked by a quiet endurance, a continuation of the same qualities that had carried her through the earlier trials of her life. She remained dutiful to the end, participating in family obligations as much as her health allowed, maintaining her composure in public, and avoiding any action that might invite controversy. But there was no disguising the fact that her life had narrowed, that her companions were fewer, and that the vitality of earlier years had been replaced by a kind of stillness that was as much a product of circumstance as of age. The physical toll of this existence was inseparable from the emotional toll. Grief, after all, is not only a matter of the mind but of the body, and the repeated blows of bereavement can sap strength as surely as illness. In Sophia's case, the two worked together, each intensifying the other. The loss of siblings and friends weakened her spirit. Her weakened spirit made her more vulnerable to illness. Illness, in turn, made it harder to seek out or sustain what companionship remained. It was a cycle from which there was no real escape, only the gradual acceptance of its inevitability. Even in her final years, however, she retained the dignity that had always been a part of her. The rituals of dress, the careful attention to appearance, the measured courtesy of her manner. These remained intact, not because they were empty forms, but because they were part of how she understood herself. In a life where so much had been determined by others, the maintenance of her public image was one of the few things she could still control. That control, however limited, was a form of strength, and it allowed her to navigate the closing chapters of her life with a measure of grace. Sophia's death, when it came, closed a life that had been shaped from beginning to end by the structures of monarchy, the expectations of duty, and the limitations of her position. The losses she suffered in her later years had reduced her immediate family to a small remnant, and many of those who remembered her youth were gone. Her passing was marked with the appropriate ceremony, her place in history noted with the respect due to a daughter of a king. Yet the private story, the loneliness, the unfulfilled possibilities, the quiet courage with which she bore her burdens, was known only to those few who had truly shared her life. Looking back, it is impossible not to see the tragedy of her final decades as the culmination of a pattern established much earlier. The same restrictions that had kept her unmarried, bound to her parents' side, and under constant observation also left her ill-equipped to face the solitude of old age. Without a family of her own, without the independence to create new attachments, she was left to rely on the dwindling circle of those who had been there from the start. As each of them was taken away, she was left increasingly alone in a world that seemed both familiar and strangely empty. The contrast between Sophia's public and private lives remained as sharp as ever. To the outside world, she was a figure of enduring royal dignity, a symbol of a past era, a constant presence in the background of the monarchy. To herself, she must have been something different. A woman who had given her life to duty, who had borne the weight of family obligation without rebellion, and who had endured loss after loss in the quiet confines of royal life. It is this duality, between the serene figure seen by the public and the solitary figure who lived behind the palace walls, that gives her story its deepest poignancy, and that makes her life, even in its quietest moments, a testament to both the costs and the endurance of a life lived entirely in the shadow of the crown. Sophia's final years unfolded quietly, a continuation of the gentle withdrawal from public life that had begun well before her health failed. She was no longer a visible figure in the rhythm of the court, no longer the steadfast companion at her father's side, or the unassuming presence in the background of royal events. Her life had narrowed into a routine that revolved around rest, the company of a few trusted attendants, and occasional contact with the remaining members of her family. Age had left its marks on her both physically and emotionally, and yet she carried herself with the same measured grace that had been expected of her since childhood. There was no drama in these years, no public scandal or significant political role, only the steady persistence of someone who had long ago accepted the contours of her existence. The palace rooms where she spent much of her time were familiar, almost unchanged from earlier decades, but the faces had altered. Those who served her now were not the same who had known her in her youth. They treated her with the deference due to her rank, but could not share in the long memories that connected her to the earlier reign. Her siblings' absence was felt more sharply with each passing season, as was the absence of her father, whose long illness had once dominated her days. The quiet of her surroundings, broken only by the occasional letter, visit, or formal audience, was a stark contrast to the noise and energy of the large family household she had once known. Her health was fragile, and she was often confined indoors, but she did not complain openly. She had been raised to endure discomfort without outward display, to maintain composure regardless of her personal feelings. It was a skill she had honed over many decades, one that allowed her to appear serene even when she was tired or in pain. This same restraint meant that few outside her immediate circle knew the true extent of her physical difficulties. To those who saw her at a distance, she remained the same Princess Sophia, slightly withdrawn, impeccably courteous, and unfailingly proper. When her death came, it was not accompanied by the kind of public mourning that follows the loss of a more prominent royal figure. Notices were made, ceremonies performed, and respectful words spoken, but there was no great outpouring of emotion from the public. For most people, she had been a shadowy presence, a name on the periphery of the royal family, someone they knew existed but rarely thought about. Her passing was acknowledged, then quickly absorbed into the ongoing life of the monarchy. Within the palace, among the few who had known her well, the loss was felt more deeply, but even there it was tempered by the awareness that she had lived a long life under conditions that left little room for change. In this way, her death mirrored her life, quiet, dutiful, and largely unnoticed beyond the walls of the royal household. It is tempting to view such an ending as tragic, yet it also reflects the nature of the role she had been given. She had been shaped from birth to serve without drawing undue attention, to support the image of the monarchy rather than to stand at its center. Her invisibility to the public was not accidental. It was the result of a system that valued certain members of the family as figureheads while keeping others in the background. Today, Sophia's story resonates for reasons that go beyond the details of her own experience. It is a reminder that history is often written around the most visible figures, monarchs, consorts, political leaders, while those who lived in their orbit remain largely unexamined. Yet these quieter lives, shaped by the same forces of duty, expectation, and public scrutiny, can reveal just as much about the human cost of royal life as the stories of those in the spotlight. Sophia's life, in particular, speaks to the constraints placed on women of her rank, whose personal choices were limited, and whose identities were often defined entirely by their relationship to others. Her existence also challenges the assumption that royal life was one of unbroken privilege and satisfaction. Sophia enjoyed comfort and security, but these came at the price of personal freedom and emotional fulfillment. She had access to the finest clothes, the grandest rooms, and the most attentive service, yet these luxuries could not compensate for the absence of autonomy, companionship, and the chance to shape her own future. This imbalance between material wealth and personal liberty is not unique to her era. It remains relevant in discussions of modern public figures who live under constant observation and within rigid expectations. There is also a more universal dimension to her story. Many people, whether royal or not, have experienced the feeling of being overlooked, of living in the shadow of more prominent relatives or colleagues. Sophia's life reflects the quiet endurance of those who contribute to the stability of a family, an institution, or a workplace without ever receiving recognition for their role. She was not a leader in the political sense, but she was a steady presence during times of upheaval, fulfilling duties that were necessary even if they were not celebrated. In this way, she represents the countless individuals who shape history indirectly, whose influence is real but rarely acknowledged. The societal expectations that framed her life are also worth considering in the present day. The idea that certain roles must be performed without complaint, that personal happiness should be secondary to public duty, has not disappeared. While the specific conditions of Sophia's life were unique to her position as a royal daughter in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the underlying pressures can still be found in modern institutions and families. Her story prompts reflection on how these expectations limit individual potential, and how easily they can be accepted as inevitable simply because they are long-standing. Remembering Sophia is, in part, an act of restoring balance to the historical narrative. She may not have altered the course of politics or commanded armies, but her life sheds light on the inner workings of the monarchy, the treatment of women within that system, and the personal costs of maintaining a public image. These are elements of history that are often hidden behind more dramatic events. Yet they are essential for understanding the reality of royal life. Without them, the picture is incomplete, showing only the surface of grandeur without the depth of human experience beneath. In acknowledging her, we are also acknowledging the broader truth that history is not only the sum of great achievements and crises. It is also the accumulation of quiet lives, lived in the background, that nonetheless support the visible structures of power and tradition. Sophia's life may seem small in the grand scope of historical events, but it is precisely this scale that makes it meaningful. It shows us the texture of daily existence within the royal family, the persistence of duty over decades, and the emotional landscape of someone who gave much without asking for recognition in return. Her legacy, then, is not in monuments or laws or recorded speeches. It is in the lesson that visibility is not the same as importance, and that the worth of a life cannot always be measured by public acclaim. She is a reminder that the stories left untold can be just as revealing as those that dominate the historical record. By looking more closely at figures like Sophia, we gain a fuller understanding of the human dimension of history, seeing not only the triumphs and failures of leaders, but also the endurance of those who stood beside them, often unseen. In considering her final years and the manner of her passing, we are prompted to think about how society values different kinds of lives. Sophia's quiet departure from the world was not a sign that her life lacked meaning, but rather an indication that meaning can exist independently of public recognition. This is a valuable perspective in an age where visibility is often equated with significance, where the measure of a person's impact is too often taken from their presence in headlines or on public stages. Her story also serves as a caution against assuming that the life of a royal, or anyone living within a system of inherited privilege, is free from hardship. The challenges may be different from those faced by others, but they are no less real. Loneliness, loss, and the frustration of unfulfilled potential are not diminished by wealth or status. In Sophia's case, these challenges were made sharper by the restrictions of her role, and the public's lack of interest in her personal story. By bringing that story to light, we can better appreciate the complexities of lives that might otherwise be reduced to footnotes.
Remembering Sophia is an act of recognition of her as an individual, of the limitation she faced, and of the quiet strength with which she lived. It is also a recognition of the broader pattern she represents, of the many lives that unfold away from the center of attention, yet are deeply tangled with the forces that shape history. Her legacy is not in what she changed, but in what she endured, and in the insights her endurance offers to those who look beyond the obvious. To let her story fade entirely would be to lose a valuable piece of the past, a perspective that challenges the simplified image of royal life as one of the constant splendor. By preserving her memory, we honor not only her, but all those whose contributions to history have been hidden by the more dramatic stories of their time. In doing so, we create a richer, more honest account of the past, one that makes room for the voices and experiences that have too often gone unheard. Sophia's life, quiet though it was, deserved this place in our understanding, both for what it tells us about her world and for what it still has to say to us.